security against malicious internal users.
Aloha, folks. So first off, my company is requiring me to say that this presentation is my own experience. It's informed by my own opinions and my own thoughts. These are not the opinions or thoughts of Gap Inc. as a corporation. However, I am happy to say that I've got plenty of experience to help you avoid the pitfalls that I've seen occur to people along the way. So a little bit about me. I live and work in Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm a principal systems engineer and GAP's Active Directory architect. I'm a trainer for adsecurity.org. That's Sean Metcalf's website. I'm a principal consultant for High Tech Hui, which is a company out of Hawaii for providing security services to organizations over there. I'm also a consultant for several other organizations in Hawaii and outside. There's a couple of my contact bits there. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or have any thoughts or feedback or insights into the presentation I gave today. So this is just a summary of what we're going to cover today in this talk. So first off, we're going to talk about the background. In essence, why is this a problem? Why is this talk relevant and pertinent in our security world today? First off, insider threats are real. There's a number of different organizations that have produced reports that indicate and prove statistically that insider threats occur. We've seen numerous different types of attacks. So the first one is a report through Crowd Research Partners indicating 90% of organizations that they surveyed feel vulnerable to insider attacks. Organizations surveyed cite users with excessive privileges as the highest risk factor for those insider threats. Insider threats are cited as the second highest concern after ransomware, while exfiltration of user credentials and information is the most common data type that was exfiltrated. That's information from the SANS organization as of 2017. US CERT has an entire threat center dedicated to the insider threat. So it's an important concern. It's something that needs to be considered and needs to be addressed. My fifth bullet point there is Edward Snowden. No citation needed. Okay, so what is the problem? Fundamentally, it comes down to frequently organizations will deploy their network in such a way that it leaves resources open to malicious use by folks inside the company, as well as folks outside the company. But in this talk, we're focusing on inside. Some of those things include putting plain text passwords in GitHub, private GitHub or public GitHub, different types of wiki tools, knowledge bases, that sort of thing. But there's other issues that we need to take into consideration, and so that's what I wanted to focus on here. The key point is traditional methods of alleviating risk are no longer sufficient. It was Bill Cheswick that said, Bill Cheswick from Bell Labs, that described using a firewall as having a crunchy shell around a soft, chewy center. Well, that soft, chewy center is very exposed to us. We need to defend it. So this concept, the concept of tiered access, can help you do precisely that. So by segregating administrative accounts and resources away from your standard users and standard application usage, as opposed to administrative usage, we can greatly improve our organization's security. However, it's so much easier said than done. I've encountered a number of pitfalls. There's a couple of pointers I can give you along the way to help you identify things that you should avoid doing or things that you should focus on doing. So we'll get into those as we go. This presentation is focused primarily on Microsoft platforms, specifically around Active Directory. Active Directory as a service is used in approximately 90% of the Fortune 500 in the United States, and it's fair to say that your organization more than likely has Active Directory somewhere in its security chain. This right here describes the fairly standard kill chain of an external attacker. However, insider attackers follow much the same path, except for they sort of start at that pre-compromised computer. They've already been granted a computer. They've already been granted a user account, so they already have access. So from there, their goals are to escalate their privileges, right? They need to become admin. Some organizations make this easy. Raise your hand if your organization just grants your users administrative access to the workstations if they request it. Yeah, there's a few hands going up. It happens more than we'd like to admit, right? So that privilege escalation is kind of already accomplished for an insider many, many times. So following that kill chain, they attempt to look around, find out what they have access to, and what's their next step. They look for credentials at the domain level. They're looking for that domain admin gold mine. From there, they move on to domain dominance through a number of different possibilities. We're not going to dig into that, but once they have domain admin, there's really nothing they can't do in your Active Directory organization. So what we're attempting to do with this talk and with this tiered access is we're attempting to disrupt that kill chain at the domain admin level. We're trying to preclude them from gaining access outside of their local machine. So this is a description of what I like to call the swamp, or the null tier. This is a fairly standard organization. So the workstations are on the same roughly physical network. There may be some routing involved, but there's very little firewalling in between. There's a user, I'm going to call him Mr. Ackerman. That's his workstation right there. You can see he's got email, office applications, he's got a web browser. The network offers several services, and they're listed up here at the top. We've got Active Directory and random other services. There's SQL, there's web application services, that sort of thing. So this is a fairly standard use case for a user. They go ahead and they log in. They're prompted for credentials. They enter those credentials, and if validated, they're authenticated against Active Directory, and they have a token now on their Windows machine. Now, this person, Mr. Ackerman, happens to be a local administrator on his workstation. So from there, he accesses the things he would normally access as a user. He has no administrative access to anything, but he has the ability to talk to the web app, to talk to Active Directory, to enumerate attributes of objects, that sort of thing. So this is a fairly standard process, right? Fairly standard organization. However, it leaves the organization open fairly dramatically. And so we're going to talk about why. So next step, this is Admina. She's an admin for this organization. So Admina comes in the morning, she grabs her coffee, she logs into her computer. Notice, actually, I want to point out that her workstation has administrative tools as well. So it's not just mail, office, browser, that sort of stuff, but she's got the RSAT tools, so she can admin Active Directory, she can admin DNS, DHCP, whatever it is she's responsible for. So she goes ahead and authenticates. She logs in. Because Admina is a trusted administrator in the organization, she is a domain admin. So at this point, she has administrative access to all the things that she needs to be able to touch. She has user access to all the things that she needs to be able to do. And her life is fairly simple, right? She logs in with her domain admin account and goes about her daily work, some of which might include browsing funny cat videos on the internet. So why is that a problem? Well, Mr. Ackerman is actually Mr. Hackerman. And so he wants to do something nefarious inside. He does not currently have domain admin access, but he needs domain admin access. So what does he do? He installs some form of malware on his computer. Keylogger, could be Empire, Mimikatz, and any number of different exploitation tools. And from there, he says, Admina, I have a problem. Please help. So Admina, being the helpful person she is, she comes over and she helpfully enters in her credentials to go ahead and fix the problem. She fixes the problem, wanders away. But Windows Security Subsystem leaves her credentials behind. Her credentials are still in memory. Not only that, but if the malware that Mr. Hackerman installed included a keylogger, as she typed in her password, those credentials were captured as well. So now Mr. Hackerman has the ability to do stuff as if he was admina. He is now a domain admin. So there's any number of things he can do from there. So how can we address the problem? So in this presentation, we address the problem through a concept called tiered access. Tiered access is a system by which we segregate and separate administrative access from other administrators and from regular users. That fundamentally is what tiered access is. A tier is just a logical collection of the roles, responsibilities, resources, infrastructure that are necessary to make a service function, to make a service do its job, and provide those services to the users. An important point here is that without policy controls and technical controls, there is no tiering. You're still back in the swamp. So it's very important consideration to make sure that you've got controls in place to help enforce the limitations that you've placed on your user space. The underlying fundamental goal here is to protect those security-sensitive credentials from those inside attackers. Now, there's actually a happy benefit here that this also makes life very difficult for an external hacker. They would first, of course, have to jump through the external compromise and get in there, but it makes their lives very difficult as well. So what are the requirements for tiered access? So this is a very, very high-level list of the requirements. So you need to define tiers. So how do you define tiers? The way I like to do it, it's based upon the administrative responsibilities that are distributed throughout the organization. For instance, you've got your Active Directory domain controller folks, right? Those are your domain admins, your enterprise admins. Those are the ones that have fundamental and very high-level control over your Active Directory. From there, I listed out server admins as another potential tier to consider. Those are the folks that manage your storage on the network, your storage area networks, your network attached storage, that sort of stuff. Workstation admins should be considered a different tier, and we'll talk a bit about the reason why coming up in a bit. And then another very common tier are servers, just very broadly member servers. So that would be SQL servers, that would be Exchange if you still have that in your environment. That would be a variety of different member servers, just ensuring that we're not including domain controllers with that. Now, these are only examples. For your organization, you may administer things differently. It's possible that your administrators administer Active Directory and storage and workstations and servers. So we will talk a little bit about how we can address that sort of situation as well. But the fundamental idea here is you have to define the tier, and there has to be very clearly defined administrative boundaries between the tiers. In addition to that, you need to have policy controls. Policy controls are organizational policies like end user license agreement type things that say you're not going to misuse the computer. And very importantly, here are the ramifications if you misuse your computer or your account. Those are policy controls. Technical controls are things like your firewall rule sets, IPsec, group policy, other things that enforce your requirements from a technical standpoint, not just a policy standpoint. So an underlying concept that we need to make sure is abundantly clear, and this is true for this talk, but it's also true for many, many other contexts that you might encounter. I like to call it the security slide rule. So in essence, what this means is when you provide a lot of usability to your users, fundamentally you decrease security. By making things more usable, you make things less secure. On the opposite side of that, if you improve security, that usually comes at the cost of usability. Think of two-factor authentication, for instance. So two-factor authentication is great from a security perspective, but now a user has to pull out his phone or pull out a token or do something else. He has to take additional action in order to be able to do his job or her job. So fundamentally, by improving security, you've decreased usability for that user. So you need to strike a balance. You need to find some place that's in the middle. And nobody can dictate that to you. There's no speaker that can say, this is how you do it. That's up to you and your organization, how you strike that balance. But that balance needs to be struck. So this is just a quick little diagram to summarize what tiered access functionally accomplishes. So in this case, for this organization, we've designated two different tiers. So we have a yellow tier, we have a green tier. A point that I'm going to reemphasize a couple of times here is the fact that the nomenclature of the tiers doesn't matter outside your organization as long as you maintain consistency inside your organization. You have to have clear documentation of the nomenclature. Everybody needs to know what yellow tier means. Everybody needs to know what green tier means. There's a few other examples we'll touch on later on. But so with these tiers, we've decided a few things. We're going to have tier-based roles. The roles are, in essence, groups of permissions that have been granted to entities within the organization to accomplish administrative tasks. So that's, you can see I've got a yellow tier user role over here. In addition, I've got a yellow tier privileged admin workstation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I'm going to reemphasize the concept of privileged admin workstations for a couple of reasons. I'll talk more about that as we go. So functionally what happens here is, also very important, you have technical boundaries, technical controls in between the tiers. So you'll see what that means in shortly. So your yellow tier users can access yellow tier resources. So whatever you've defined as being yellow tier, they're allowed to access that. Your green tier users likewise. However, a very important point with tiered access is that the tiers cannot access each other. You cannot take a yellow tier role user account and access a green tier resource in any fashion. Likewise, you can't take a green tier resource and access a yellow tier resource. So that separation is a critical component of the concept of tiering. There's a number of ways to accomplish it. We'll talk more about some of those as we go, but fundamentally, this is the idea. You segregate roles and segregate administrative access to the services that those roles are required to administer. A key point is that regular users, identified down here, regular users, including the regular user accounts for your administrators, and including the regular workstations that they would use to check email, to browse funny cat videos, open Office documents, those accounts and those computers are not allowed access to any tier. Now, this has the happy side effect of pretty much not affecting your end users. If you have users that are not administrators, implementing a tiered concept should not affect them in any significant manner. So what does that buy us? How does that help us? So I didn't animate this. I figured I've probably already beaten you over the head enough with animations. But you can see in this case we've got our yellow tier. We've defined Active Directory, our member servers, as members of the yellow tier. We have our technical controls. We also have our policy controls in place. Because of that, Mr. Hackerman asks for help from admina, admina being a domain admin. And number one, she knows that she's not supposed to log in with her administrative account on that workstation. So either she chooses not to do it, or she attempts to do it and is precluded. Remember the technical controls, right? So through the technical controls, in Windows land, for instance, you can specify that groups of users are not allowed to authenticate to machines. So in this case, we've told our workstations that domain admins are not allowed to authenticate to regular workstations. So because of that, even if she circumvents the policy controls, she is precluded from logging into Mr. Hackerman's compromised machine by the fact that the technical controls preclude that action on her behalf. So I want to pause real quick and just ask if there's any questions so far. Okay, it's a fairly simple concept, but the implementation of it gets quite a bit more complicated. So this right here is just a diagram of what we would consider an extended tiering model. So in this case, we've broken things down into 3 different tiers. We've clearly defined Active Directory is a member of our red tier. So we have red tier roles Those are going to be users that are granted domain admin equivalent access. They have red tier privileged admin workstations, and also I've included bastion hosts, red tier bastion hosts. We'll talk a little bit more about the idea of bastion hosts coming up in a bit, but fundamentally this is just an extension of that simpler concept that we were looking at. So you can see we still have separation between our tiers. We still have clearly defined services that fall within a specific tier. We still preclude our regular user accounts and regular computers from accessing those other tiers in any sort of administrative fashion. So this is one example. Being more complicated than this can sometimes result in more hassle than it's worth, a lot of effort. So we'll talk more in a bit about some of the recommendations I have for actually making this work and some of the pitfalls to avoid. So some of the important considerations when looking at tiered access for your organization. Your organization's security requirements are key. Your org security requirements are going to be what defines what type of technical controls you put in place, what type of policy controls you put in place, what your organization considers acceptable, and what it considers not acceptable. I like to reference back to the security slide rule. You have to strike that balance for your organization. Executing tiered access most definitely requires executive support. You will have to spend money. You will have to spend time. And both of those things, without executive support, are going to flag over the course of time. So having ongoing executive support can ensure that you execute your tiering strategy successfully and then maintain it over time successfully. Your organizational security policies as they stand today may need to change. Many organizations I've seen have policies that say you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, but then there's no ramifications if you do. There's no teeth to the policy. So what I mean by this is if your user agreement for your organization says you are not allowed to install unapproved software on your workstation, there should be ramifications for doing so. You should be disciplined, get a sharp talking to, have a finger wagged at you. And at the highest levels, potentially be disciplined, suspended, potentially dismissed from the organization. So your policies may need to be addressed and modified in order to make this effective. I like to propose that your Active Directory administrators are the highest level, the most secure. Whatever you consider to be the most secure tier, that should be your Active Directory people. And the reason why is Active Directory, if you're not familiar with it, ties very deeply into many aspects of an organization. And distilling it down, Active Directory is really just an overglorified telephone book. But that overglorified telephone book includes the passwords for computer accounts, passwords for services, passwords for users, includes administrative controls, includes authorization controls, allowing or denying access to a variety of different resources. Because of that, and honestly because of the simplicity of taking action on the domain controllers as a tier, that's generally the first one I like to shoot at. So in essence, by shooting at your domain admins, you get the most bang for your Swiss franc or your buck or your Deutschmark, whatever it might be. So shoot at the domain admins first. Now, I mentioned simplicity. The reason why I mentioned simplicity is because from an Active Directory standpoint, the critical infrastructure elements really are the domain controllers. So you structure around those domain controllers, you define a tier that includes the domain controllers, and includes, very importantly, the bits that tie into the domain controllers. I mean, your networking, your storage, and put controls around those. That should be your first goal. Honestly, that's relatively simple. It's much simpler than trying to shoot at workstations, for instance. How many people have an organization where the workstations have a variety of different operating systems? Probably quite a few. So trying to enforce technical controls across multiple operating systems can be something of a challenge. Many organizations have taken to heart the recommendation to ensure that your domain controllers are a modern operating system, right? And so hopefully there's no more 2003 domain controllers out there. If there are, hopefully there's a plan to transition out. If you're in an organization where you've got a mix of 2016, 2012 R2, 2012, 2008, my recommendation is make an effort to get to a consistent platform. There's a lot that's improved as the operating system version increases. Okay. Defining the scope of the tiering project is a very important component as well. The reason why is because scope creep is something that we've probably all encountered. We define a project, we say this project encompasses X, Y, and Z, and then some executive comes along and says, what about F? We need F. Or what about J? We need J. And so the scope of your project increases over time. So my recommendation to you here is you clearly define the scope very early on with input from all stakeholders. That includes the executives, that includes the administrators, that includes the managers of the administrators. Get that sort of organizationally broad buy-in to your project. You have a much higher chance of success if you do that. So I touched on this bottom point a few times already, but it bears reemphasizing. Ensuring that you use consistent language as you document, as you communicate, as you present your project is very, very important. I offer some examples down below. So the ones I've been using so far follow a coloring nomenclature. I've got a red tier, I've got a yellow tier, I've got a green tier. If you've got a blue tier, define what that is and make sure everybody knows what it is. I can't tell you what it is. I'm just saying that if you're going to define it, make sure it's clearly defined and clearly communicated. Other iterations of nomenclature include tier 0 versus tier 1 versus tier 2. A question for you. Which one of those is the highest tier? Is it the one that's numerically highest? Is it the one that's numerically lowest? Again, I can't tell you which one. You have to define that for your organization. You have to communicate it, and you have to stick with it. There's many other possible iterations of this. I mean, you could use a variety of different things. These are the ones that I've seen most commonly. That's all. Other important considerations. So at the end of the day, you need admins. That means you need to instill a certain amount of trust in those admins and what they do. So instilling that trust, establishing that trust is important to do in an appropriate manner. When I say appropriate, I mean in a manner that involves validation from others, right? So if somebody says, I need to be a domain admin, who do you ask to determine whether or not they actually need to be a domain admin? And then from there, which role do you pipe them into? So understanding the chain of trust for any particular role will help you succeed in your tiering efforts. A very important point is your roles and the trust implied with them needs to be managed over time. As you grant trust, you also need to revoke trust when that particular user no longer needs those privileges. You revoke their membership in the role, and from there they have their regular user account still. They can check their email, open Office documents, and browse funny cat videos to their heart's content. So within the tiering role, I've mentioned the term roles quite a few. Within the tiering concept, I've mentioned the term role a number of times. So role-based access control is a very important consideration within this concept. By defining roles, you define sets of accesses. You're not just defining Active Directory groups, but you're defining a set of broad privileges across multiple things that a particular user should be able to access administratively. If you're looking at a tool and it doesn't support role-based access control, throw it out, because you need to manage this stuff based on roles. That's the way to succeed in the long term. Otherwise, you just end in a swamp of random usernames that are granted access to random things, and that's no fun for anybody. An important consideration, I've seen it in literally 100% of the implementations I've been involved with, is that there is going to be some bleed through between tiers. The example I give here is one that's fairly common. Nowadays, having virtualized domain controllers is not just a common thing, but it's actually a good thing. There are benefits to having virtualized domain controllers. However, the virtualization admins that manage the hosts on which your domain controllers effectively have physical access to your domain controllers. Effectively, that's what they have. If you're using VMware, they can copy off the VMDK, and they can open up the Active Directory database and hack away at it offline to their heart's content and do whatever nefarious thing they want. So having some control on the hypervisor side to preclude that sort of action is definitely an important consideration. So how do you do that? Well, it's going to depend on a couple of factors. One is the virtualization platform that you're using. Some are better than others. I like VMware. I like Hyper-V. Hyper-V actually, with 2016, has some very incredible capabilities. Shielded VMs, for one. Shielded VMs stops that entire thing. The function of shielded VMs shielded VMs encrypt the virtual machine in such a way that the folks that are meant to manage those virtual machines can open them up and decrypt them. But even your hypervisor administrators cannot just grab the disk and copy it off and open it up. The key is secured. Those VMs are shielded from that access. In the case of VMware, there is no rough equivalent of shielded VMs, but there are other technical controls you can action to help protect against that. One I'll mention is BitLocker. You can turn on BitLocker, which is Microsoft's built-in disk encryption tools within Windows. And from that point, if you're a hostile admin of the hypervisor or of the storage that the hypervisor uses walks away with the VMDK, they cannot access the information that's inside there. So the point is, you have to understand that and take into account that some bleed through between tiers is likely going to happen. So identify it, recognize it, and then control for it. The support stack for your organization needs to be very, very clear. When I say the support stack, I mean which group is contacted for support at any one of the tiers. So if we step back to our extended tiering model, so if somebody needs support for something with a domain itself, or there's a domain-wide policy that's causing a problem, the support stack, the support process needs to be clear on who is contacted from there. I also want to point out that administering the domain controllers is not the equivalent of administering the user accounts that are within Active Directory. That should be the purview of a different group. So this is purely for administering the domain controllers and the domain at a very high level. So the support stack needs to be very clear. That means documented, that means communicated, that means agreed upon. So the support group for a particular tier needs to agree that that's what we support. Additional important considerations. Automate all the things. Automation, I like to think of it as a force multiplier. If you've got 5 admins in your organization for any particular service, and you need to do something across 10,000 machines, how long is that going to take? If you automate, probably not so much as if they had to go in and do it manually, right? So the more you automate, the less manual effort your admins have to put into place. Additionally, automation has a benefit around avoiding fat finger typos. I've been there, you've probably been there as well, where you've entered another DNS record and it's far too long and you typo a character and then the application doesn't work. So by automating these things, you help avoid the fat finger concern. You also help avoid malicious entries. So we all in this room know what man-in-the-middle attacks are, right? So a malicious DNS admin, for instance, could stuff a DNS entry that points traffic to an external server that he controls, or an internal server that he controls, and then he uses that to harvest credentials. So automation helps preclude that. If it's done automatically with no manual intervention, it helps prevent that sort of action. The second bullet point on this slide, I say self-service with structured approvals is handy. Now, really what I'm speaking about here is if somebody needs access to a role or wants access to a role, there has to be a mechanism by which they can take action themselves but then have approval from a different level in order to make that take effect. So, for instance, you've got we're back in our extended tiering model. Somebody needs a yellow tier account. They need to be able to access member servers administratively. So they open up a web page. This could be SailPoint, Identity IQ. There's any number of other ones. But they open up the web page. They submit the request. They identify this is the role that we need to be a member of, the type of account we need to obtain. And from there, an approval request is passed to whoever is responsible for that tier. So at that point, there's an element of self-service. But there's also, very importantly, an element of control from the folks that are authoritative for the tiers in question. So I mentioned a few times the idea of bastion hosts and bastion workstations. They go by a few different names. You might hear admin host, you might hear jump host. Fundamentally, they're the same. The idea of a bastion host is it's a very tight, very hardened instance of a server operating system that holds all of the tools necessary for an administrator of that tier to do their job. Other very important considerations of bastion hosts are they should be very tightly monitored. You should have your security incident and event monitoring paying very close attention to those. That's where administrative connections should be coming from. If you see them coming from elsewhere, then you may have a problem. One major benefit of implementing bastion hosts in this manner is that for your administrators that have multiple tool sets, instead of having to update that tool set across multiple different workstations, you just update it on the bastion host, then all of your admins, regardless of how many you have, then have that updated tool set available to them. Bastion workstations is a similar concept, but with a clear distinction that this is the piece of hardware that your role, that your tiered roles user accounts need to log into. The idea of having an admin workstation, privileged admin workstation, or bastion workstation, is that you keep the credentials away from your standard hardware. The standard hardware that's allowed access to the internet, there's email access to them. Those are the most common avenues of compromise for organizations nowadays. So by keeping those credentials on physically separate hardware, you very cleanly ensure that, very cleanly help ensure that that they're not compromised as easily as they could otherwise be. Bastion workstations come in a number of different flavors. Some key points around them is these should be the most secure. These, along with the bastion hosts, should be the most secure devices in your network. They should be locked down very, very tight. When I say very tight, I mean the bastion workstation should not have email on it. There should be no internet access to it. There should be no Office applications on there. Its purpose in life is to provide a relatively secure environment for your administrative credentials to log in. So just sort of as a digression, many organizations throw up a red flag at that. They say, wait, I now need to carry both my regular workstation and a separate piece of hardware? No, I'm not going to do that. There's ways around that. One that I've seen work in the past is you can use something like a Microsoft Surface tablet. These things are small, they're light, and they're very effective as privileged admin workstations. They have a TPM. They can have Windows Enterprise. They can be locked down via GPO. They can have credential guard. They're very effective. Another method that I've seen work is when you have a beefy piece of hardware as your admin workstation, and then have a virtualized operations workstation inside that. So, a virtualized user space workstation inside there. So your physical hardware is tightly locked down. That's your privileged admin workstation. The virtual machine that's inside it, that's a lower security environment. So what this means, and the benefits this provides, is when you enter admin credentials, they do not pass into the low secure VM. You enter admin credentials into the physical hardware, and it stays within the physical hardware, accesses that tier's bastion environment, that tier's servers, and that's it. If you need to browse funny cat videos, you open up your regular workstation VM, you log inside there. You're entering low privileged credentials into a high privileged environment. So that's a relatively safe process. The opposite is not true. Do not take a low-privileged physical workstation and put an admin VM inside it. That's a recipe for failure. The reason why is because just putting a keylogger on the low security workstation compromises all of the creds that you enter into the high security workstation. Okay, so security incident and event monitoring, alerting, critical to this concept. The idea here is you're trying to preclude certain things. So if you're not actually watching for them, then you may miss when it's being misused or when it's being circumvented. Documentation, I can't say enough how important documentation is. This is not an unintuitive concept, right? You don't necessarily tell a user, oh, we're implementing tiered access, and that user knows precisely what you're talking about. Document it. Publish the documentation. Help people understand. One thing I want to point out here is I call out specifically runbooks. Runbooks in this context are how does a yellow tier admin do their job? How does a red tier admin do their job? So defining the processes that they need to follow is important. Other important considerations, the environments that you have in scope. You may have environments that just aren't, they just don't lend themselves to tiered access. So understanding the environments is an important thing. That means the Active Directory domain functional level, the forest functional level, the different operating systems you have available to you. The technical controls that you have available. That's in part going to play within that first bullet point. Dependent upon the operating system, you might have some features available to you, and others may not be available to you. I also call out specifically group policy objects, System Center, Operations Manager, and Configuration Manager. Those are all force multipliers. Those are excellent ways to ensure through technical means that your desires are enforced and your configurations are enforced. IPsec I call out because remember, we're supposed to maintain some segregation between our different tiers. So for instance, your privileged admin workstation can have IPsec set up in such a way that it's allowed to remote desktop to your bastion hosts for that tier. And on that bastion host, you ensure via authentication over Kerberos with IPsec that only privileged admin workstations, meaning the members of that Active Directory group, are allowed to the remote desktop protocol. The beauty of that is compromises like the TS-CON compromise are completely obviated at that point. You try connecting to remote desktop on the bastion host that has IPsec configured that way, and you can't even establish the three-way handshake for TCP. So the available technical controls are important to understand, the ones that you have available to you. Likewise, which technologies are available? What do you have to play with? What do you have to work with? Do you have virtualization technology? Do you have an extensive cloud presence? Do you have UEBA implemented in your environment? You can take all of these things and leverage them to support your tiered access efforts. So understand the technologies that you have available and see where they can fit. Also, there's 2 points I want to leave you with. One, security is never done. No matter what we do, no matter how many steps we take, there is never a point where we are secured, right? It's only a question of how secure we are. Are we more secure or are we less secure? An attacker is going to look for a less secure environment, generally speaking. Unless you're being explicitly targeted by like an advanced persistent threat, something like that. If you have more security, the likelihood is an attacker is going to move on and pick a softer nut to crack. Also, tiered access is not a cure-all. It doesn't fix all the problems. It helps address quite a few of them, especially the ones around credential theft. So understand that you still need to follow basic best practices for your environment. Okay, questions on important considerations? Okay, so there are numerous pitfalls. I don't mean the video game. I mean these are things that that can adversely impact the result of your tiered access efforts. So I've seen these things in reality. Some of them are hypothetical. So the key one is thinking that implementing tiered access makes you secure. By implementing tiered access, you are now done, you're secure. Per the previous slide where I said that there is no such thing as secure, that's not true. This helps you be more secure. That's what it does. Dictating action instead of collaboratively planning. The reason why this is a recipe for failure is there are going to be elements of your organization that hold it against you, that you've dictated action, especially if that dictation involves them carrying around a second piece of hardware. People will not like you. And because of that, they may do things to sort of subvert the process, and that can make your efforts fail. If you do not define your tiers clearly, that's another potential pitfall. You need to define your tiers clearly, understand the services that are involved, make sure that they're documented, and make sure that they're communicated to the rest of the organization. Another one that I've seen more times than I'd like to admit is incomplete execution. That's where you provide a tiering process, you provide the model, you begin the process of executing, and you stop halfway through. So let's say we have our extended tiering model. We've got a red tier, we've got yellow tier, we've got green tier. We've gone ahead and we've secured our red tier. That's fairly well done. But now there's no real will in the environment. You lost that executive support. There's no real will to execute at the yellow tier. So at that point, your domain admins are fairly well secure. Good. That's actually a very good thing. I would say that's probably 75% success right there, even though it's only one tier. However, that means you still have your member server admins potentially logging in at regular servers, meaning those regular workstations, meaning those credentials are exposed. So Mr. Hackerman could potentially gain access to an important member server, SCCM, for instance. A compromise of SCCM could result in the compromise of everything in the organization. So by not completing the execution, you still leave yourself open incrementally. So it's best to take it in chunks. I guess it comes back to the idea: how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So your tiers should be bites. You take them one bite at a time and take action, execute to your plan. This first bullet point is fairly common. Fire and forget is when you spin it up, everybody's all excited, and then you forget about it. You don't do any cyclical review to make sure it's doing what you want. You don't keep things up to date. You don't roll with the times. So fire and forget can leave you in a bad state over the course of a longer period of time. So my recommendation is you make sure you review on a cyclical basis. Another pitfall: insufficient documentation. I've hit this one several times. I don't think it bears a whole lot of further expansion. Just understand that the documentation needs to be clear, it needs to be consistent, and it needs to be available. By ensuring your documentation is living, that means over time, as your environment changes, the documentation is updated to keep pace with it. Insufficient training. So this one, in essence, means once you've spun up tiered access, you have to ensure that the different roles know how to do their job. So documentation is one part of it. Training is another part of it. So sitting down with them, walking through the process of logging into their privileged admin workstation, using their two-factor authentication, accessing their bastion hosts, and then doing their job. So that training is quite important. More pitfalls. Okay. No or insufficient monitoring. So no news is good news, right? Not necessarily. So a saying I like is monitoring or awareness of a compromise does not mean you haven't been compromised. So if you have no awareness that you've been compromised, it's still entirely possible you've been compromised. So this point, in essence, says pay attention to your security incident and event monitoring. All permit and no deny. This one is a little tough to action. In Microsoft land, we have something called the implicit deny. That means if you're not granted access, then implicitly you are denied access. However, there are some roles that have a lot of control that can circumvent that. For instance, your domain admins. So domain admins are granted local administrator privileges on every computer added to the domain. Every Windows computer added to the domain. So what that means is every single workstation, every single member server has domain admins as a member of the local administrators group. That means domain admins can log into that ops workstation and expose domain admin credentials just like Admina did early on. So what I'm trying to get at here is there are technical controls by which you can deny access to domain admins to log into those same computers. In doing so, your domain admins can still do their domain functions, they can still access their privileged admin workstations, but they're not able to log into things that they shouldn't be logging into based upon your tiering model. There are controls of this deny type that will help you. So make sure to understand what they are and leverage them where you can. Bespoke ACLs. What I mean by this is when you manually create an ACL on an object, like an OU or a group policy object or something like that, especially if you add an individual user as opposed to a group to that ACL, it can very quickly muddy the waters of your control. It can very quickly result in inadvertent over-permissioning of things, and that can lead to further compromise. More pitfalls. So incomplete application of policy or technical controls. So for instance, we talked about group policy. So you look at GPO, you've got your default domain policy, default domain controllers policy. You configure them, you twiddle them, and then you're done, right? No. Those GPOs you need to augment. You need to increase, you need to add GPOs that are specific to the different tiers that allow or deny rights for the different access types. So having a technical control isn't sufficient. You need to actually leverage that technical control. Restricted groups versus group policy preferences for controlling local group membership. Now, historically, we've been able to use restricted groups to define who's a member of local admins. However, that's a weak mechanism and it's fairly prone to failure. The reason why is because only the winning GPO, only the latest applied GPO is the one whose restricted groups takes effect. So if a user has permissions on his OU, for instance, he can add whoever he wants to his local admin groups by modifying a group policy object at that level. Group policy preferences, on the other hand, provides a nesting mechanism for local membership nesting. And that includes your local administrators. Not addressing existing sensitive group memberships and permissions. What I mean by this is when you execute a tiering concept, one of the things that you're trying to do is control membership in your administrative groups, using domain admins, for an instance. Prior to a tiered access concept, that could have service accounts, that could have, Joe user who needed to install an application and didn't know how or didn't have rights on his workstation, something like that. If you implement tiered access, an important component of it is to go through and address the existing admin group memberships and make sure that their membership is sensible for your tiered concerns. Okay. Other pitfalls. This is the last slide of pitfalls, I promise. Reusing existing management infrastructure for your Bastion hosts and workstations. The reason why I point this one out is because oftentimes organizations will share automation credentials. That means service accounts, that means run as accounts for SCOM, that sort of thing, between for an entire organization. So if you don't maintain that separation and you use the same, let's say, SCCM service account on a standard workstation as on a privileged admin workstation, take a wild guess where an attacker is going to go. They're going to go straight for SCCM. They're going to compromise that service account, or they're going to compromise that run as account, and they're going to take over your privileged admin workstations. So keeping that administration separate is a good idea. That could come in the form of using different service accounts, or at the extreme level, it could come in the form of completely separate SCCM environments. Okay, the final one I'll leave you with is attempting a big bang. So remember I asked the question, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Okay, so trying to do this all in one shot is a recipe for failure. People get exhausted. People make mistakes. And it becomes very onerous to the organization when you attempt to do this all at once. So taking it in consumable chunks is definitely a way to help ensure that you're successful in your efforts. There are a couple of alternatives. However, I'm going to point out the reasons why they're not sufficient on their own. An air-gapped administration model, for instance. Honestly, air-gapped administration is a great model. It's just very difficult to manage. It's a difficult, concept to execute properly. It's more difficult than tiering by a lot. Zero trust is the concept that an internal network is no more inherently trustworthy than an external network. That's a good start, but it's not sufficient. Temporal group memberships. These were introduced with Server 2016 and the 2016 domain functional level. The cool part about that is you can time-bound group membership. However, attackers are smart people. They do things like set up WMI triggers that say when a person who is a member of domain admins logs in, capture credentials. So at that point, if you have, let's say, 1 hour's membership in domain admins, you log in, the hacker's got your credentials. So that is not sufficient on its own. Protected users group, introduced in 2012 R2, I believe. In any case, that provides a very strong protection against delegation attacks, things like that. However, the rights are still in place. The credentials can still be stolen, even though not the NTLM hash, but they can still be reused. Only if you implement silos and other elements around it can you make that perfectly functional. So in other words, you have to combine it with other technical controls. The concept of red forest, it's a great concept. However, it's not sufficient on its own, specifically because the credentials can still be captured and misused. So you want to ensure that if you do implement red forest, it is a great concept. If you implement it, make sure that's a component of your tier model. Credential guard and device guard, both are very awesome new technologies available in Windows 10. However, again, not sufficient on their own. So credential guard, it sounds like that would protect you from credential theft. And it does, however, it does not protect against misuse of the credentials while they're available on the system. So Mr. Hackerman could make use of Admina's domain admin privileges. Even though he can't steal the credentials themselves, he can misuse them while they're available. Okay, so in conclusion, implementing tiered access comes with challenges. It's not a simple thing. It requires organizational coordination. It requires technical coordination and coordination between different technologies. However, done right, it can greatly improve the security of your organization. It can protect your credentials against those attacks. Take the important consideration section into account before you implement, if possible, preferably in the design phase. Even after implementation, the pitfalls section can help you identify where your implementation was maybe could have been improved. You can then take these suggestions and fix them over the course of time. The final bullet point I'll leave you with is sometimes the completed implementation bears no relation whatsoever to the actual design you put out there. So here's the thing. If it works, document it and go with it. Okay, so questions? Oh, come on, I know my presentation wasn't that good.
I have a question about the initial example.
Okay.
In that case, admina is using regular user's machine to enter her credentials, and this tiered system discourage her from this. But regular users can still use each other's machines to enter their credentials. Wouldn't a better policy be to discourage any user from using untrusted machine to enter their credentials?
So yes, it's a good idea to ensure that a user can only access his own machine. Sure. That can be a component of that broader security policy that I was talking about. So that would help. It's fairly difficult to action though, right? Like let's say you've got an organization of 50 users. At that point, you're tying an individual user account to an individual workstation. Do I have that right? Okay, so that's fairly easy to manage. There's some automation you could put around that to ensure you can do that. But if you've got an organization of 10,000 users, then at that point, automation becomes absolutely critical to making it actually work, right? So That's definitely a consideration. However, how do those users actually retain or obtain help from the help desk or the administrators? In this example here, Admina was one of what amounts to the admins, right? The swamp of everything admins. So how then would Mr. Ackerman get help? So a help desk user, a help desk role should be defined at that point and then also be granted access. And so you end up in a similar situation where you've got help desk users that can then log into multiple machines. There's another consideration which sort of ties into that. I didn't mention it. It kind of falls into the best practices, but for each workstation, they should also have different local administrator accounts, right? That's a general best practice to help prevent that sort of lateral movement. So doing the one, meaning tying a domain user account to a specific computer, should also come with ensuring that it's got a unique local admin password. So in doing so, at that point, you limit them to that one machine. You help ensure that their credentials can't be misused on other machines, but those credentials still would have user-based access elsewhere, so they could still be stolen and misused.
Thank you very much.
Other questions, or are we done? Are we at time?
No, it's no time.
Okay. Thank you very much. I bid you aloha. And thank you so much for your attention.